everybody, and welcome back to another Dryptosaurus video. Statistically, most of you are probably coming from my previous Prehistoric Kingdom videos, so I don't have to do the spiel that I'm not playing Monster Hunter. But today, in light of the new update that recently came out, I wanted to kind of rush out a little bit of a follow-up to my last video, which is, just generally going over the designs, and specifically focus on some of the content from the new update, because it has a public beta open right now. So Gallimimus is, our big thing. And this is a super, super amazing animal. Like, it's really, really cool. And so I definitely wanted to, cover it and talk about it, as well as some of the other dinosaurs that would have lived alongside of it, maybe, or definitely. We are not sure. There are some controversies regarding the dating of some of its potential friends. So, initially, let's go over the formation and the design that I've given the enclosure here, and then we will talk about the animal itself. So, the enclosure that I've designed here is, we can go into first person, as you can see, a pretty dense kind of wetland environment. And initially, it actually didn't look like this. I had made the mistake of thinking that Gallimimus was from the Jadokta Formation, I believe is how it's pronounced. But it's not. It's from the Nemeth Formation. But you'll see why I made that confusion in a little bit. So this enclosure is perhaps a little bit too dense in terms of foliage, but I just wanted to kind of jam a bunch of plants in here, because another thing that came with this update is paleobotany. So now you don't have to have grass in your dinosaur enclosures. You can have this very wide variety of very nicely modeled ferns and cycads for ground cover. And these are generally East Asian plants that I picked here, none from North America. And then in here I have this little shelter where these guys might be hanging out. And so this is my little enclosure here. It is worth noting that this is probably a little bit too small for Gallimimus. They're very active animals, and they're great runners. So this enclosure is probably not adequate for them. I'm not going to comment on anything that developers have set for their behavior or social groups because it might be placeholder. What I will absolutely comment on, though, is one aspect of their sociality that seems to be complete, and that is their feathering and their display features. So let's get all three of the models here. So one thing that I really like is that for all of the different breeds, I guess you could say, the morphs of Gallimimus, they all have very different degrees of sexual dimorphism. So let's get a first-person view here. So this guy is obviously the most extreme. This is a very, very extravagant sort of plumage that you would see. And I'm having interesting thoughts about this stripe here. So one thing that I'm really interested in when it comes to paleo art is the plausibility of certain colorations. So colors don't just appear on animals, right? You have a lot of different ways that these colors can show up. For example, on these Gallimimus specifically, there's like 4 or 5 different, processes of color creation that are occurring here. Also, something that not a lot of people think about, Gallimimus is huge. This is a big animal. I actually have a toe claw from a Struthiomimus, which is Gallimimus. Actually, this is not a toe claw. This is a hand claw from one of Gallimimus's close relatives. And I have it right here. Oh, I also have a mosasaur tooth. So for reference, this is the tooth of a mosasaur. Not a big one, but this is the hand claw of an ornithomimosaur from Hell Creek. This is gigantic. It's a very big animal. It's huge. These are not pushover animals, and that really comes into effect once you realize that in this game, their closest relative is... Where are you? This guy. And that is very apparent when you shrink it down to a kind of Gallimimus size. They almost look the exact same. So that's our baby Dinochirus. And that's the adult. They look a little bit different, but they do have very similar facial anatomy. They have similar arms. They don't hold their arms in a very similar way. But those big hand claws are not hidden on the Dinochirus like they are on the Gallimimus because there's no feathers on them. Look at that. Those are gigantic hand claws, and that's really awesome. Also great are the scales on the feet, as I commented on in the last video. These are the types of foot scales that you want to see on theropod dinosaurs. That's very consistent with what we find in the fossil record, even though it's limited. The foot claws are also quite blunt, which is good. They're spending a lot of time dragging on the ground, so they should be blunted compared to the hand claws. Now, onto the coloration of this one. This first one is the only one with really, I think, implausible coloration. It has this purple streak in the neck, which is going to be made with a combination of probably um, maybe structural coloration, carotenoids. I'm not sure, but there's probably some structural coloration at play here. And the fact is, if they have this downy, fuzzy feathers on their body compared to the big pennaceous feathers, they're not going to be able to produce that if they don't have very like typical modern bird contour feathers on their bodies. So these simple feathers shouldn't be able to produce a color like that. That's obviously very minor. I do really like the way that the feathers are laid out on this guy. I love how they curl up on the top of the head. That reminds me of, I think it's the crested aracari. It's kind of toucan that does that. What's up with the dew claw? Do they have a dew claw? Okay, that is actually accurate. So Gallimimus, and presumably Deinocheirus as well, have feet with a very highly reduced first digit, so it's not going to appear on the outside of the body, which is interesting. I was not expecting that. I actually didn't know. The body feathers of this guy are super interesting. They're like stark white, and then they transition into this kind of muddy color here, which is probably going to be due to melanins. Basically, all these pigments are melanins. The brighter reds might be carotenoid, but on these guys, just about everything is melanins, and then there's this like band of what is either structural coloration or something else going on there. There is obviously the possibility that there's a new undiscovered pigment being produced in these animals. I really like this forked tail fan here. I wouldn't say it's particularly implausible, but it is not, justified by the fossil record in any way. There's no evidence to support this structure or support this one. We just know that, Coelurosaurs in many cases probably had tail fans, especially Manoraptorans, which as we know, definitely all Manoraptorans have these. And these guys are super, super closely related to Manoraptorans. They are the closest thing to a Manoraptoran that is not a Manoraptor, actually. It's surprising that they're not super closely related to birds because they have this great big bill on their face. And I do like how some of these are very round. I don't know particularly how plausible that is. I've not spent a ton of time working with ornithomimids, which is unsurprising. Basically, all of my work with theropod dinosaurs has been with living birds. But the bills here are very nice and rounded, and they're not really, sharp and pointy and fearful and predatory, which is good because it's an herbivore. It doesn't need a big hook on the front of its bill for tearing through meat, even though it probably did occasionally eat stuff like insects. This is a fast and powerful animal. Probably could have also, eaten eggs or even small dinosaurs. In nature, there are not really clear-cut lines between herbivory and carnivory. Lions will eat grass, and deer will often eat each other because nutrients are in everything. And, your diet is really just depends on what nutrients you're best at processing. Anyway, onto the coloration of this guy. This one is very clearly inspired by little blue herons or something along those lines. With this blue patch on the face. This is probably either a carotenoid or a structural coloration type deal. I would say it could be a carotenoid, particularly because it's more expressed in the male than it is in the female. And in a lot of animals that engage in a lot of sexual competition, having more carotenoid coloration is an indicator of greater fitness. So animals like sticklebacks, which are kind of fish, will express carotenoids more frequently in males to the point where they'll actually pull them out of their body, and they do serve an important function. And so these sticklebacks are actually becoming less actually reproductively fit to advertise reproductive fitness. It's possible this guy's manifesting them here. A lot of carotenoids are found in plants, and so herbivores have greater access to them than carnivores. And then we have this guy. This yellow color on the legs, that's going to be from pheomelanin pigments, and then the brown color on the body is great. I actually really love how these ones are not particularly sexually dimorphic. I think it's really interesting. There are subtle differences here, but not every species has bonkers sexual dimorphism like this. And I think this is something that a lot of people are a little bit jumpy on. They're a little bit eager to include crazy differences in sexual dimorphism, but it's not always so direct. Sometimes animals are just a little bit bigger than others. If you look at, Smilodon, that's the main thing. And it's probably the case with a lot of animals like dinosaurs that, it wasn't super crazy, although it is also possible that it was. There's a whole area of the fossil record that we just cannot access. Well, I guess not a fossil record, the areas of extinct life that we can't access through the fossil record. But anyway, this Gallimimus design is really amazing. I really quite like it. I will give it a solid 10 out of 10. I think the wings are beautiful. I really, really love this animal and the way that it moves. And I also love the way that they interact with each other. They're really awesome. Let's look at the babies. So one thing I think that's super interesting that really drives home the point of Gallimimus and Deinocheirus being related is that their babies look almost identical. Like, they look super, super closely related. You look at, I don't know, a Tarbosaurus baby. Those do not look like similar theropods at all. But Deinocheirus baby, Gallimimus baby, they're super closely related. And the offspring reflect that. Most of their differences in anatomy are a consequence of Deinocheirus just being so much huger. One thing that I want to highlight again with Gallimimus is that, just like Velociraptor, it has mottled pin feathers, which is super cool to see. And once they hit a certain age, boom, they pop into their actual adult feathers. I don't know if they would happen that late, but it's possible. There's no way for us to tell. Unless we have, like a million Gallimimus preserved that are all at different ages, and then we can estimate what age their pin feathers broke at. But that's really cool to see. And the adults will release pin feathers as well and molt them when their feathers get old. But yeah, so then the Namex Formation is a very wetlandy environment. There's a lot of lakes. And then over here, I have another Namex Formation exhibit because I was on a kick and I was like, let's do another one. And so this is another very popular Namex dinosaur, maybe more or less so than Gallimimus, depending on how much dinosaur exposure you have. A lot of people, I feel like, really like Tarbosaurus. But this guy is a juvenile Tarbosaurus. I have some adults in here as well. This guy is melanistic, which is a genetic mutation that causes the overproduction of melanins. And that's actually how you result in animals like black panthers. They're not true panthers. Well, okay, it gets complicated. So panther can refer to a few things. It can refer to a cat in the genus Panthera, which is not actually inclusive of the animal, the panther. That's in Puma. The genus Puma concolores, the panther. But the genus Panthera does not include panthers, which is terrible and confusing, and I really, really don't like it. But when you see a black panther, it is going to be a pantheran cat, a cat in the genus Panthera, that has this melanistic mutation. And it's not the same one in every species. So in jaguars, for example, it's dominant. So one black panther parent will produce a black panther child, but in leopards, it's significantly rarer because both parents need to have the gene to produce the offspring. Then here's a young Tarbosaurus. I think the young Tyrannosaurs in this game are modeled super excellently. I want to see what the tooth anatomy is like. It's pretty good. It's Ziphidont. They kind of are steak knife shaped, but they're not super thin sliced and cutting. Let's get a Carcharodontosaurus in here to compare. Yeah, let's get you. So Carcharodontosaurus has very skinny teeth. And if we look here, come on, open your mouth. He's not having a good time. But Carcharodontosaurus has very skinny, laterally compressed teeth that are more for slicing, whereas Tyrannosaurus... Oh, there we go. There we go. So this guy, you can see, has super long, super skinny teeth. The Tyrannosaurs have larger, wider teeth that are more crushing. So if the Tarbosaurus decides to open his mouth here, yeah, you can see those teeth are very robust and very wide. The male and female Tarbosaurs in this game have a little bit... Oh, that's perfect. Yeah, so look, these are just like absolutely railroad spike shaped. They're so wide. That is a bone-crushing bite. The Tarbosaurs in this game have a little bit of sexual dimorphism going on. The males are a little bit brighter in color than the females are, but it's quite subtle. It's not anything like a big display feature that you would notice or anything like that. The adults are featherless, which I think is pretty reasonable for an animal that's living in this climate that is this size. I think some feathers are probably possible on the eyelashes and things. They got the binocular vision right. They're not sticking their eyes out to the side. And furthermore, they have lips. When we think of lips on dinosaurs, we are often talking about, stuff like this. These are stiff. They're not particularly motile. They're not sucking lips like on mammals because dinosaurs don't need to suckle. That's why mammals have those flexible muscular lips is so that they can, drink more milk more efficiently. The scales on the face are pretty nice. We tend to see larger scales around the mouth. There is actually somewhat of an error here, and that's that this part right here, when he opens his mouth, you'll see it more clearly. There we go. Perfect. So this animal's actually missing a muscle on its design, a muscle or a ligament, depending on what you follow. But this big projection of bone right here in this reconstruction is capped by a scale. This is called the jugal horn or the jugal scale. And this is a fairly recent paper, so I don't fault them at all for doing this. But there should be a muscle called the exoperia that wraps around here and attaches to this, and that's just going to help pull the jaw closed. So this Tarbosaurus is a little bit skinny in the face. It could do with an extra facial muscle. But beyond that, the design is really excellent, and I want to draw attention to this feature right here. This is a dewlap. Now, if you'll notice, the T-Rex in this game actually doesn't have. So the adult Tyrannosaurs, no dewlap. They're not gonna have anything like that. Do they have a feathered T-Rex? Yeah, they do. But so that is a dewlapless animal. You go to the Tarbosaurus, dewlap. Why is that? Well, it's because I don't know if it's ever been officially documented, but there are photos from a dig site working on Tarbosaurus where there was a skin impression shaped like this under the skull, and it had scales on it. And so they interpreted it as a dewlap, which I think is a valid interpretation of that. It's highly. Oh my gosh, they do like a perfect noise. I love that noise for them so much. The sound design in this game is so good. But they would have had this fleshy dangling structure under their head, like in a knoll, which is a kind of lizard. The patterning on these guys is super great. It's a little deserty, which is potentially accurate to where they would have been hanging out. The Namex Formation is wide-spanning. They could have lived in desert environments, but a lot of the remains we know of are from wetlands. So something like this. Now, inside this Namex Formation enclosure, there's actually another species, if I can find it. So also in here, potentially controversially, I have some little Protoceratops. Now, you might be wondering, what is Protoceratops, an animal from the Jadocta Formation, doing in the Namex Formation? If you're not super into paleontology, those might not mean anything to you, but they are two distinct fossil ecosystems from Mongolia. The Namex Formation is known for things like Tarbosaurus, Gallimimus, Dinocyrus. The Jadocta Formation, on the other hand, is known for animals like Velociraptor. However, there is potential evidence and talk that the dating of these formations might be incorrect, and that they might have coexisted not only temporally, but they might represent some species crossover. So, even though they're fairly different ecosystems, I have put some Protoceratops in here, wandering around in the Tarbosaurus enclosure. This is 2 videos now where I put Protoceratops in an enclosure and then I don't talk about it, which I know must suck for all the Protoceratops fans out of there. But I promise I will do a breakdown of its anatomy soon. But yeah, I just have to say I really like the Gallimimus design. I really am loving this new update, with all of the quirks that it has, like the animals getting stuck on things. And the paleoflora is just the most excellent thing. One thing that's super cool about this is that I actually can include grass in my Namex Formation exhibits now, which is very bizarre. And if you watch my last video, you might know the grass wasn't reaching in North America. However, there's potential evidence of grass from a slightly older than this Chinese hadrosaur that had grass stuck in its teeth. And then more so, there's some grass in a sauropod footprint from around that time. So we know that grass was in East Asia, and so that's why I've chosen to put grass in this kind of wetland environment, because I think it works well. With that, I'm going to give both these designs a pretty solid rating. I'll give the Tarbosaurus probably a 9.5 out of 10. With context, 10 out of 10, there's no way they could have known that the exoperia was going to be discovered. I mean, this is a new muscle. There's no provenance for this in any of the dinosaurs' living relatives. It's present in lizards, but it's not present in birds or crocodiles, so there's no way to predict it. So this Tarbosaurus design, if I'm being fair and cordial, gets a 10 out of 10. It's updated as much as it can be with the science at the time it was made, but they fixed the T-Rex design before when the paper about lips came out, so I have faith that they'll do that with Tarbosaurus. The Gallimimus, easy 10 out of 10. It's beautiful and wonderful, and its anatomy is just so perfect, and I love the feathers. The only complaint I have is with the skin, and it's not even a complaint. It's just like, I'm not so sure if these feathers would be advanced enough for that. It could be another kind of pigment entirely. The breeding system I'm having some issues with, so I haven't quite gotten it to work. But yeah, so that's my thoughts on this update so far. I will make a longer video about some more species when the time comes, and I'll absolutely, when the full update release, I'll make a big video covering Oviraptor, and then maybe the breeding mechanics will be more elaborated on, and I'll be able to talk about them better. But with that, thanks everybody for coming by. Have a good morning, night. I hope you're doing well, whatever you're doing. And I look forward to seeing you again. And thanks for coming by my channel if you stuck it with me this far. Huge thank you to all my paid supporters, of course, and I will list them on the next screen. So thanks everybody, and bye-bye.